What does it say about a society when help arrives late, questions come before aid, and responsibility dissolves into silence? On a winter evening in December 2012, in one of the most crowded cities on Earth, a young woman set out to do something entirely ordinary. She went to the movies with a friend. She planned to return home before night grew too late. There were no warnings, no reckless decisions, no intention to defy social norms. What followed would not only end her life, but expose a chain of failures so profound that it forced a nation to confront itself. This is the case that came to be known around the world as the Delhi 2012 assault. It is often described as one of the most brutal crimes of the century. That description, while accurate, is incomplete, because brutality alone does not explain how this crime unfolded, nor why its consequences were allowed to deepen. To understand what truly happened, we must look beyond the attackers and examine the system that surrounded them, the system that hesitated, delayed, and, in critical moments, did nothing at all. The victim was Jyoti Singh Pandey, a 23-year-old student with plans for a future shaped by education and service. Her family had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they themselves never had. She represented a generation striving forward through discipline, ambition, and quiet resilience. On the night of December 16, 2012, her life intersected with a sequence of institutional breakdowns that no individual could have anticipated or overcome alone. This story is not told to shock for the sake of shock. It is told to document how a crime became possible in plain sight, how bystanders failed to intervene, how emergency response faltered, how law enforcement arrived, departed, and returned too late, and how justice, when it finally moved, did so under the weight of global outrage rather than immediate duty. These are not abstract questions. They are concrete decisions made by real people within real systems. Decisions to ignore, to delay, to defer responsibility. The consequences of those decisions were irreversible. The horrifying details of that night have been discussed extensively elsewhere. What matters here is the context that allowed those details to exist at all, because crimes of this magnitude do not occur in isolation. They occur where accountability is fragmented and compassion is conditional. These stories are more than headlines or viral moments. They are warnings etched into public memory, reminders that justice cannot depend on outrage alone. To continue examining cases where truth, responsibility, and human dignity collide, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Each file we open is a step toward understanding not only what happened, but why it was allowed to happen. This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of a system that failed when it mattered most. The victim and the ordinary night. Before her name became a symbol, Jyoti Singh Pandey was known simply as a daughter, a student, and a young woman working toward a future her family had struggled for decades to imagine. She was born on October 10, 1989, into a lower-middle-class family originally from a small village in Balia, Uttar Pradesh. Her parents carried with them the quiet determination of people who understood scarcity not as an abstract idea but as daily reality. Jyoti's father worked long shifts as a baggage handler at the airport. He had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, but poverty forced him to abandon his education after high school. When he moved his family to Delhi, he did so with a single conviction. His children would not be denied education simply because he had been. This belief was not universally shared within his extended family. In a society where sons are often viewed as future providers, investing heavily in a daughter's education was considered impractical, even irresponsible. Jyoti was the eldest of 3 siblings, with 2 younger brothers. Relatives advised her parents to prioritize the boys. Her father refused. Court records and later interviews show that Jyoti's parents sold their remaining land and family heirlooms to fund their children's schooling. They lived in a modest home in a densely populated neighborhood near informal settlements in southwest Delhi. Life was not easy, but it was disciplined. Education came first. Responsibility was expected. From a young age, Jyoti expressed a desire to become a doctor, not as a romantic ambition, but as a practical one. She wanted stability. She wanted to give back to the people who had sacrificed everything for her. By her early 20s, Jyoti was studying physiotherapy, a field she had chosen after determining that medical school tuition was financially out of reach. Even this path required relentless effort. To support herself, she worked night shifts at an international call center, often sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a day. Friends later recalled her calm resolve. When asked how she endured such exhaustion, she answered simply that she had no alternative. According to those who knew her, she did not complain. She planned. On December 16, 2012, Jody was 23 years old and preparing to begin a new internship the following week. That Sunday afternoon, she called a friend, Awindra, a software engineer she had known for nearly 2 years. They decided to meet in the evening. Jody asked her parents for permission to go out, a detail that would later be misused by those seeking to assign blame. Her parents agreed. Before leaving, she made tea for them. It was a small, ordinary gesture. Then she stepped outside. They met at a shopping complex and decided to watch a film. The choice of movie and location carried no significance beyond convenience and affordability. After the screening ended, they planned to return home. Their original intention was to take a motorized rickshaw directly, but no driver was willing to make the longer trip at that hour. Faced with limited options, they took a short ride to a nearby bus stop, expecting to find another vehicle there. Nothing about this sequence was unusual. Millions of people in Delhi make similar decisions every day, navigating transportation gaps through necessity rather than choice. At the bus stop, a private bus approached. It was not a public bus, but private buses frequently operate in the city, especially at night. A young man stepped off, claiming the bus was headed in their direction. He insisted there were other passengers already inside. A public bus passed by at the same time, crowded and uncomfortable. Wanting to avoid the crush and return home on schedule, Jody and her friend boarded the private bus. From that moment forward, the night ceased to be ordinary. But it is essential to understand what came before it. There was no recklessness, no violation of curfew, no defiance of cultural norms. There was only routine decision-making within a city that demands it. The danger did not arise from her actions. It arose from what followed and from what failed to intervene. Understanding Jody's life and that evening is not an exercise in sentimentality. It is a correction. Because when narratives attempt to explain violence by dissecting a victim's choices, they distract from the true point of failure. The system did not collapse because a young woman went to the movies. It collapsed because when everything went wrong, too many safeguards that should have existed simply did not. What followed after Jody Singh Pandey stepped onto that private bus was not a sudden explosion of chaos, but a rapid collapse of safeguards that should have prevented the worst from happening. The crime itself unfolded within minutes, yet the failures surrounding it stretched far beyond that confined space, extending outward into the street, the emergency response, and the institutions entrusted with public safety. Shortly after the bus departed, it became clear that it was not traveling in the intended direction. When Jody's companion questioned this, the atmosphere inside the vehicle shifted. According to later testimony, the men aboard began making aggressive remarks, challenging why the two were out at that hour and asserting control through intimidation. The bus doors were locked. The lights were turned off. The vehicle did not stop. At this stage, the crime transitioned from deception to violence. Jody's companion was assaulted and restrained. When Jody attempted to intervene and seek help, she became the focus of the attack. What happened next was later described in court proceedings, medical reports, and survivor testimony. It is not necessary to repeat those details here. What matters is that a sustained act of extreme violence took place inside a moving vehicle, in an area where traffic continued to flow and where the presence of other people was not absent. After the assault, Jody and her companion were thrown from the bus onto the roadside. The location was not remote. It was a stretch of road that remained active even at night. Vehicles passed. People saw them. Yet no one intervened. This moment marked the first major systemic failure. Multiple witnesses later acknowledged seeing two severely injured individuals lying by the road. Despite visible distress, no immediate assistance was offered. No emergency call was made. The reasons varied. Some cited fear. Others claimed uncertainty. Together, these explanations formed a familiar pattern: responsibility diluted by distance and anonymity. When everyone sees, no one acts. Eventually, a police officer on patrol heard cries for help and approached the scene. He found Jody and her companion critically injured. Their condition required immediate medical intervention. The officer attempted to secure assistance, covering them with jackets and improvised bedding. According to his later account, dozens of bystanders gathered, watching but not assisting. He repeatedly asked for help contacting emergency services. None responded. The next failure came not from civilians, but from authority. A police vehicle arrived and left without providing aid, citing lack of prior notification. Another arrived and focused first on questioning the responding officer rather than assessing the victims. Valuable minutes passed. In trauma cases, minutes can determine survival. Those minutes were lost. When Jody and her companion were finally transported to the hospital, additional delays followed. Medical staff were not immediately mobilized. Family members were not promptly informed. Documentation took precedence over urgency. Her companion waited hours before receiving proper examination. These were not malicious acts. They were procedural ones. But procedure without judgment becomes negligence. Jody's condition was catastrophic. Surgeons later testified that they had never encountered injuries of such severity. Despite this, she remained conscious for a time, providing information that would later assist investigators. Her statements were recorded carefully, even as her physical strength faded. Medical teams worked through the night, performing multiple surgeries in an effort to stabilize her. At this point, the system began to move with determination. But this response came after irreparable harm had already occurred. The contrast was stark. When intervention was most needed, hesitation ruled. When the outcome had already become public and irreversible, urgency followed. The failures of that night cannot be attributed to a single individual. They were distributed across layers of responsibility. Bystanders assumed someone else would act. Police deferred action until protocols aligned. Medical systems adhered to process rather than prioritizing speed. Each decision, considered reasonable in isolation, combined into a devastating outcome. It is critical to state clearly what this section is not suggesting. It is not claiming that faster response alone would have guaranteed survival. It is not simplifying complex trauma care into a single missed moment. What it demonstrates is that Jody's suffering was prolonged by delay, and that the system designed to protect her did not function as intended at multiple points. Crimes of extreme violence test the strength of institutions. This one exposed their fragility. Long before courts convened and protests erupted, the first verdict had already been delivered on that roadside. It was a verdict of inaction. Public attention did not turn toward the case immediately because of institutional urgency. It turned because the facts once known were impossible to contain. Within hours of the attack, fragments of information began circulating. Within days, the incident had ignited national outrage. Only then did the machinery of the state begin to move with visible force. The investigation progressed quickly once pressure mounted. Closed-circuit television footage from the area allowed police to trace the bus involved. The vehicle itself became the first critical lead. It was located within days, bearing physical evidence that corroborated survivor testimony. Arrests followed in rapid succession. Phone records revealed that the perpetrators had used the victim's stolen device to communicate with one another, an error that accelerated their identification. In technical terms, the case was not difficult to solve once it received priority. This contrast exposed a central truth. The system was capable of acting decisively. It simply had not done so until public scrutiny made inaction untenable. 6 suspects were arrested. 1 was a minor. The others were adults. Charges included kidnapping, sexual assault, attempted murder, and destruction of evidence. The legal process unfolded under intense media attention, both domestic and international. For many observers, this attention raised an uncomfortable question. Would the same urgency have existed without global outrage? The trial became a focal point not only for justice, but for broader societal reckoning. Proceedings revealed how procedural efficiency can coexist with moral delay. Evidence was presented clearly. Testimony was documented meticulously. Medical findings were unambiguous. Yet even as the court addressed the crime itself, public debate shifted toward the system that had failed before the courtroom ever became involved. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was the treatment of the juvenile offender. Under existing law, the minor received the maximum sentence allowed for his age, 3 years in a rehabilitation facility. Upon his release, public anger reignited. Protesters argued that the punishment reflected outdated legal frameworks ill-equipped to handle extreme violence. Lawmakers faced renewed demands for reform. The sentencing of the adult perpetrators was equally consequential. 4 men were convicted and sentenced to death. In India, capital punishment is reserved for what courts describe as the rarest of rare cases. The decision signaled the judiciary's recognition of the crime's severity. Appeals followed. Clemency petitions were filed and rejected. In 2020, nearly 8 years after the attack, the sentences were carried out. While these outcomes were framed as justice, they also underscored the reactive nature of institutional response. The harshest penalties arrived only after irreversible harm and sustained public pressure. Justice was delivered, but late. Beyond the courtroom, the case exposed deeper ideological fractures. Interviews given by one of the perpetrators prior to his death, along with statements made by defense counsel, provoked international condemnation. These remarks did not express remorse. Instead, they reflected a worldview that normalized control over women and reframed violence as provoked or justified. The outrage that followed was not limited to the crime itself, but to the attitudes it revealed. Documentaries examining the case were produced and, in some instances, banned. Officials cited concerns about public order and national image. Critics countered that suppressing discussion did not prevent harm but concealed it. The tension between accountability and reputation became yet another layer of systemic failure. In response to sustained pressure, legal reforms were introduced. Definitions of sexual assault were expanded. Sentencing guidelines were revised. Fast-track courts were established to reduce delays. These changes were significant. They also raised a sobering reality. Reform came after tragedy, not before. Jyoti Singh Pandey's case forced a reckoning that extended beyond one city or one legal system. It revealed how institutions often respond not to suffering, but to visibility. When crimes remain unseen, they remain unaddressed. When they become public, urgency follows. The investigation and trial did what they were designed to do within their scope. They identified perpetrators and imposed punishment. What they could not undo was the chain of failures that preceded them. Law enforcement did not prevent the crime. Emergency response did not act swiftly enough. Social norms discouraged intervention. Legal reform arrived only after irreversible loss. This is where the system stands exposed. Not as a single broken entity, but as a network that functioned too late at every critical point. Accountability in this case was not absent. It was delayed. And delay, when measured in human suffering, carries its own consequences. The question that remains is not whether justice was served, but whether justice should require a national uprising to exist at all. When justice comes too late. In the years since December 2012, the name Jyoti Singh Pandey has come to represent far more than a single crime. It has become a marker of reckoning, a moment when a society was forced to confront truths it had long avoided. Her death was not only the result of brutal violence, but the consequence of delay, silence, and institutional hesitation layered one upon another. The legal system ultimately delivered punishment. The perpetrators were identified, prosecuted, and sentenced. Laws were amended. Procedures were revised. On paper, accountability was achieved. Yet none of these outcomes can restore what was lost, nor can they erase the reality that meaningful action arrived only after irreversible harm and global outrage. What this case leaves behind is not closure, but a warning. A system that functions only when the world is watching has already failed its most basic responsibility. Justice cannot depend on mass protest to activate itself. Emergency response cannot require public pressure to prioritize human life. And safety cannot be contingent on whether a victim's story becomes impossible to ignore. Jodi's parents later spoke not of vengeance, but of purpose. By choosing to publicly name their daughter, they rejected shame and challenged a culture that too often buries victims beneath silence. Their decision transformed private grief into collective responsibility. It forced a conversation that extended beyond courtrooms and into daily life, where assumptions about gender, safety, and blame quietly shape behavior. This case also underscores a broader truth. Violence does not thrive only in the presence of perpetrators. It thrives where indifference is normalized, where bystanders hesitate, where procedures replace judgment, and where institutions prioritize order over urgency. These conditions are not unique to one country. They exist wherever systems are allowed to drift without accountability. The reforms that followed Jyoti's death matter. They may save lives. But reform born from tragedy is always incomplete. The real measure of progress is whether the next victim will be protected without needing to become a symbol. This file closes with an uncomfortable question, one that extends far beyond this case. How many failures are required before responsibility becomes automatic rather than reactive? And how many lives are altered while systems wait to be forced into action? Jyoti Singh Pandey did not choose to become a catalyst for change. She chose an ordinary evening. The burden of change now rests elsewhere, on institutions, on communities, and on individuals willing to act before silence hardens into tragedy. This concludes the file. Justice was delivered, but it arrived too late. And the cost of that delay is a lesson written into history, one that must not be ignored. What happens when a violent crime is witnessed by dozens, yet stopped by no one?